Today, I'm going to say something that may surprise many. I agree with NATO, but not for the reason you might think. I'm Liu Sivaya, a war correspondent in Donbass. And right now, I'm reporting directly from the scene. And the question I've been asked the most since the beginning of the special military operation is, why hasn't this war ended yet? In fact, I myself fell into that propaganda trap. Even Donald Trump called Russia a paper tiger and said that the whole conflict could have been resolved in 7 days. We started thinking this would be more of a police operation that would end not in 7, but in 3 days. Even I fell for it, but after experiencing the conflict here at its epicenter, talking to military analysts, and of course civilians, it's very clear to me that the story is actually not that simple. Of course, without a doubt, there were things that Russia didn't do entirely well. And here they are, 12 reasons why the conflict is still ongoing today. Let's start with them, but stay until the end, because the last 2 are going to surprise you a lot, and it might even change the way you understand everything. Point number 1. Russia was clearly betting on the help of the pro-Russian elements inside Ukraine. Moreover, these were truly pro-Russian elements. That is to say, they should have, and of course, could have helped without Russia having to organize absolutely anything. Well, these were all kinds of political and social opposition agents who were already being persecuted in their own country by Zelensky's regime. So, in addition to their very clear sympathy for the Russian Federation, they already had enough reasons on their own to oppose Zelensky and the regime he leads. Point number 2 is that they didn't manage to gather enough courage to act, even while suffering constant pressure from Ukraine. One example could be Viktor Medvedchuk, who is now, for instance, in the territory of the Russian Federation. However, when it was time to act, it's not like he did much. Point number 2. It was expected that the pro-Russian population, which undoubtedly lives in Ukraine in large numbers, would act much more actively than they actually did. Point number 3, 2014. People took up arms without a second thought to protect their own territory, their homeland, and therefore their families. The same thing did not happen in the western part of Ukraine, and where some generals of the Russian Federation, even, and I say this in fact very seriously, they expected to be welcomed with flowers, or something close to it. Point number 4. People began to mobilize around the Ukrainian cause, even helping to burn tanks from the Russian Federation. Of course, we're talking about people who were already pro-Ukrainian to begin with. The rest most likely didn't act out of fear, but either way, we already know the result. A very strong resistance was eventually created within the country, which triggered the mass mobilization. The thing is, where we are now seeing people being forcibly mobilized, men being dragged by the Kyiv regime straight into the meat grinder that the Ukrainian conflict has become. Before, volunteers existed. Yes, men volunteered themselves to go to the front to protect what they considered their homeland, and values that are so deeply Western, like freedom and democracy. Come on, nothing to do with the current image. Period. The third reason is that there was a very clear mistake in analyzing the political and social situation in Ukraine. And there are even sources that say that because of this mistaken analysis, certain officials within the military leadership of the Russian Federation submitted incorrect reports. Also, in fact, they spoke of a reality that did not exist on the ground. That's why there really were people who expected Russia to be welcomed with flowers. Point number 4. Very scarce, even insufficient, Russian Federation military contingent on the ground. And the thing is, we're talking about Russia having around 190,000 soldiers there, and it's not just me saying it, even Wikipedia says so. To these 190,000, you also have to add the 30,000 soldiers from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, respectively. The total number of forces that the Ukrainian army had back then was about 200,000. That is, we're talking about an absolutely minimal difference when, according to military science, the attacking side should at least triple the defending side, and ideally, actually, it should be 5 times larger. However, as we can see, This did not happen on the ground in Ukraine. The difference between both numbers, 220,000 versus 200,000 as you can see, is extremely small, even tiny you could say. And this, for example, in a way also comes from the previous points. In other words, there was a clear miscalculation, and based on that miscalculation, they acted. Point number 5. The inability to organize quality logistics in Ukraine. This, above all, has to do with the territorial size of the country. Supplying the troops of the Russian Federation inside Ukraine was one of the key objectives for the operation. However, taking into account the previous points, where perhaps we should especially highlight the fact that the pro-Russian population in Ukraine, it could be that out of fear or for any other reasons, they did not act as expected. As for the pro-Ukrainians, in fact, as we already saw, the same thing happened to them. They acted in a much more active way. As a result of these events, the army of the Russian Federation, even after having reached the outskirts of Kiev, and here we must especially remember the landing in Gaston, where the special forces of the Russian Federation carried out an absolutely brilliant operation. However, without proper supplies, they weren't doing anything there. And that's exactly where everything started to go wrong due to the lack of well-organized logistics. The reasons for this failure are not, in fact, only due to the mood of the Ukrainian civilian population, nor to the complexity or the size of the country's territory, but rather, for example, to something as simple as the fact that Russian military drivers did not know the territory. It's something that happens to all sides. Attackers worldwide were at a disadvantage from the start. They could get lost or take the wrong path. And all of this was greatly exacerbated by the increasingly imminent lack of, and then the matter started to become almost redundant. The troops that Russia had on the ground in Ukraine couldn't be properly supplied due to a lack of well-organized logistics, while that well-organized logistics was almost impossible to achieve in well-supplied troops. Very important announcement. Before we continue, we are now fighting censorship more actively than ever. And to help me, please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. And I also ask you to go to the Liu Sivaya live channel, where many new things are waiting for you, and subscribe to it. That being said, let's continue with point number 6. This reason actually has much more to do with Ukraine's way of acting than with Russia's. It's that Ukraine managed to carry out an incredibly fast mobilization in record time. Maybe someone was helping them with that. I wonder if some alliance could be behind such an extremely fast organization, whatever the case may be. And I repeat, Ukraine managed to mobilize a large number of men who were so badly needed at that time, in an absolutely record time. And to this, we have to add another extremely important fact, which is that the government decided to distribute weapons among the civilian population, practically making weapons freely available. It has and will still have many very serious consequences. In the first days after the measure, there were even many reports of Ukrainian citizens shooting at each other, including attacking civilian cars. It's not really clear whether they suspected they might be Russian soldiers or for some other reason. This, of course, could still get worse. And I repeat, the most serious consequences will probably come later, even in a couple of years. However, if we analyze the measure in isolation, it was indeed successful in stopping the advance of the Russian Federation. Point number 7. It is absolutely absurd to deny that Ukraine, the collective West, and especially NATO, helped a lot. We're talking about around $309 billion in aid, all kinds of aid. In addition, here we can highlight the purely financial aid, which was for buying weapons, and also for other needs of the Ukrainian army, the military one, which consisted of constant deliveries of weapons, and even the media support to keep convincing, no matter what, the Ukrainian people of a possible victory that will hardly ever come. To this, we should also add the fact that the West was not only giving weapons to Ukraine, whether in the form of subsidies for their purchase or directly, but also military intelligence data. Here, the military intelligence data provided by the United States and the United Kingdom was especially helpful. And it doesn't stop there, because they even organized themselves. And I would even venture to say that joint operations were carried out between the Ukrainian army and all kinds of units that are part of NATO throughout the West. Collective point number 8. Ukrainian superiority in drones. It was very clear, and in the first days of the special military operation, it became especially evident. Later, Russia, of course, managed to reverse this trend, and now, in the vast majority of points along the front, it has air superiority in terms of drones against Ukraine. In some areas, Ukraine even wins by a large margin. However, at the beginning of the special military operation, I repeat, especially in its first days, Ukraine had infinitely more drones than the Russian Federation. Attack drones, especially, for example, the Bayraktar, which made the situation on the ground extremely difficult for Russia. Point number 9. Ukrainian superiority in communication. And here, we're not talking in propaganda terms, but in terms of military equipment. It's just that, above all, once again, in the first days of the special military operation, Ukrainian communication on the battlefield was infinitely better organized. Ukraine had military communication equipment in much greater quantities and in much better condition. They had, for example, the Harris systems, which at the time helped a lot, as well as the well-known Starlink. This is a trend that Russia also managed to reverse, both in the medium term and, of course, in the long term. But in the initial moments, this reverse trend, without a doubt, did its job. Point number 10. In the first part of the special military operation, above all, Russia completely lost both the media war and the information war. And here we really have to admit that Western propaganda was indeed financed both by and for something. And it's because, no matter how crude it was, and indeed, at times it was crude and even absurd, but it worked, because with the floods of money they invested in it, it had no other choice. Do you remember that very famous phrase that a lie repeated 100 times becomes the truth? Well, basically, this is what happened to Russia, or rather, to Ukraine. Videos were coming out of Russian tanks being burned left and right. The resistance of Ukraine, rising rapidly and confronting in a very forceful and successful way what the West portrayed as the terrible Russian invasion of Ukraine. In other words, the media silence, or rather, the media blockade of Russia, and therefore also of its news outlets, was literally total. What's more, Western propaganda even went out of its way to promote it at all costs, a narrative where it was absolutely necessary to reject Russia, everything Russian, and even the Russian people themselves, because what Russia was doing in Ukraine was absolutely terrible. But, well, it turns out that none of this is happening right now. In the case of Israel, wow, an infinitely stronger attack, clearly, with infinitely more injured and dead, the vast majority of them civilians. No. Yes, it does know how to learn from its mistakes, but at the time, it did the job that the Western side needed it to do. To this, we also have to add the fact that Ukraine became a kind of constant telethon, almost literally. Television channels were removed, media outlets were silenced, opponents and even civilians were persecuted. In short, everything possible and even impossible was done so that any opinion in the country would stop being just a mere opinion and would become the only existing opinion and therefore dominant. As a result, and also as a consequence, the Ukrainian population was left with practically no space to strengthen or train their critical thinking. I'd even say not even to stop it. Having critical thinking in Ukraine, generally speaking, in fact it was, and still is, highly persecuted. That was, and of course, still is the democracy that they fought so hard for from the West. Collective. Hypocritical and absurd, yes, but it worked for them. Point number 11. This reason, in particular, might surprise more than one person. And that's because, contrary to what Western media constantly tries to sell, Russia neither wanted this war, nor did it want to cause any harm to Ukraine, much less to its civilian population. Yes, you heard that right. Russia was, and still is, of course, protecting the Ukrainian civilian population as much as it can, and even more. Yes, to the extent of its possibilities, because unfortunately, in an armed conflict, there are collateral victims. But what it does not do is intentionally attack civilians. This is because this conflict is seen by both Russian civil society and its political elite as a civil war. In fact, this was stated and confirmed countless times by the country's leader, Vladimir Putin. He spoke of it as, on one hand, a civil war, and on the other hand, a conflict between brothers. Yes, Russia considers the Ukrainian people to be a brotherly people, and this is precisely the reason why Russia showed restraint. Of course it doesn't. First of all, in terms of civilian casualties. And the thing is, every victim, and this needs to be emphasized, especially those of Ukrainian origin, is seen and perceived in the territory of the Russian Federation by its civilian population as a real tragedy. Yes, completely the opposite of what the Western media are constantly trying to sell us. Point number 12. The previous reason could be considered the main one. However, there is one that is even more surprising, and I would say also infinitely more relevant. And now we continue. Follow my reasoning closely, because every part matters here. On one hand, it's very clear that the Russian Federation has enough means to reduce Ukraine basically to ashes, to turn the country into a sort of nuclear wasteland, to make Ukraine disappear. Russia, however, doesn't do it. The previous reason, among other things, and very specifically, is because it considers the Ukrainian people to be a brotherly people. But this is precisely where perhaps the most surprising reason for many comes in. And the thing is, even if Russia had done all the previous points right, this conflict could not have ended quickly, much less in a week, simply because it was always meant to last forever. And of course, we're not just talking about a local confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, but about a much more global and important one. The West would never have allowed this conflict to end quickly. Yes, you heard that right. The West simply never considered the opposite outcome. This confrontation between NATO, or the collective West if you prefer, and the Russian Federation, no, not organized by the Russian Federation, was intended from the very beginning to become a global confrontation. Sterling total, 224 revolution. If I had to choose, it really didn't matter. If they had chosen to reduce Ukraine to ashes, the West would have acted to put Russia in its place. By not doing so, in fact, they are doing exactly that anyway. Come on, it doesn't seem like a coincidence at all that the entire media machinery was set in motion so quickly and so well organized to carry out what seemed like a plan thought out in detail from the very beginning. And I'll give you one more preview, a detail that will surely make you think, and quite a lot. Does it seem strange to us that Ukraine actually acted as if it was already perfectly prepared for this conflict? And this last point, that everything was already perfectly prepared for a global confrontation, and the West never considered this confrontation as just one option, but as the only option it could offer the Russian Federation. I plan to show you this in detail and thoroughly. I'll do it in my next global analysis, which will be released on this same channel as soon as I finish it. Liu Sivaya, war correspondent in Donbass. Subscribe to this channel and follow me on all my social media, because what comes next is going to change the way you understand things forever. This